Let me first say that I'm honored and happy to be part of this important event and thank the conveners for bringing us together. It reveals the two sides of the present reality that should be both encouraging and disturbing. The one side being that there are growing voices that seek justice and peace for both peoples. And this kind of gathering, I think, is an affirmation of that. But it's also true, as Jeff Blankford reminded us, that there's a dreadful asymmetry in the way in which the public is informed about these realities. The media indulges in a kind of feasting whenever they get the opportunity to celebrate pro-Israeli happenings, and they practice the opposite in relation to any kind of balanced inquiry into the realities of the conflict. And we must keep both of those realities in mind if we are to understand the situation correctly. There are no better texts for assessing the damage done to the role and reputation of the United Nations by the Israeli lobby than Secretary of State John Kerry's recent statements about efforts within the UN by the US to protect Israel from the fulfillment of its responsibilities under international law and in relation to the UN. Despite the recent tensions arising over the Netanyahu speech to Congress, Kerry boasted almost at the same time on ABC News, quote, "We have intervened on Israel's behalf a couple of hundred times in over 75 different fora within the UN." And when addressing the Human Rights Council in Geneva, Kerry included a statement that could have been drafted by AIPAC or Israel's ambassador at the UN, when he said, it must be said that the Human Rights Council's obsession with Israel actually risks undermining the credibility of the entire organization. And further, we will oppose any effort by any group or participant in the UN system to arbitrarily and regularly delegitimize or isolate Israel, not just in the Human Rights Council, but wherever it occurs. What is striking about such statements by our highest-ranking government officials dealing with foreign policy is the disconnect between this unconditional support and Israel's record of disregard for its obligations under international law and with respect to the authority of the United Nations. When speaking at the March AIPAC meetings, Representative Lindsey Graham went even further when he told the audience that when serving as chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, I'm going to put the UN on notice that I will go after the UN funding if the organization takes any steps to marginalize Israel. During my 6 years as UN Special Rapporteur for Occupied Palestine, I had the opportunity to observe the manner in which international and national so-called NGOs give priority to discrediting those who offer any critical assessment of Israel's conduct. And these are so-called NGOs because they're so closely aligned with the governmental priorities and viewpoints of Israel that they should be really known as quasi-governmental organizations. And I think of UN Watch and others in that category. There are really two ways that this effort to devalue and discredit the UN and its activities takes place. One is to attack individuals, and the other is to attack the organization itself. Most consistently, a reliance on defamatory attacks on the critics as biased and even anti-Semitic whenever someone describing Israeli violations of international law or sympathetically reporting on Palestinian grievances. Coupled with this kind of personal attack is an avoidance of substantive aspects as to whether the criticisms or grievances are well-founded from the perspective of international law and human rights law. In other words, these defamatory attacks are disassociated from whether their substance is grounded in fact and reasonable interpretations of relevant law. Even those defamatory attacks, at least in my case, focused on distorted presentations of my views on a variety of issues that were made in settings other than the UN and did not pertain to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. The intended effect was to shift attention from the messenger containing these issues to the message itself. In other words, instead of focusing on the message, the hope was to generate a controversy about a disreputable messenger. With incredible persistence, UN Watch in particular circulated their defamatory attacks to prominent international personalities, including high-ranking civil servants in the UN itself, such as the UN Secretary General and the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and a variety of ambassadors of countries friendly to Israel. What was particularly disturbing to me was the extent to which these defamatory attacks were treated without examination as credible by supposedly responsible officials here in Washington and New York, who didn't even bother to check with me or with the sources that were being relied upon, and led to the endorsement of such defamation in ways damaging to my reputation, but more significantly, diverting attention from the substance of Israeli uncontestable violations of fundamental international law and human rights law. And it's what I call the politics of deflection. Instead of talking about the real issues that should be discussed within the UN, the effort is to get people to talk about whether a particular person is an anti-Semite or is in some way biased. And it doesn't rest on any facts, it rests on the repetition of the defamation. And if you repeat, as Joseph Goebbels understood very well, if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes a kind of publicly accepted truth. And that's where the, I think, very destructive effect of this kind of tactics occurred. Mentioning just one incident that is illustrative of a much broader pattern, the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, denounced me as biased, even using the word as despicable, with reference to opinions that had nothing to do with my role as special rapporteur, but referred to distortions of what I had said about 9/11 attacks and about the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing. After the first of these attacks, I tried to find out why the Secretary General would launch such an attack on someone within the organization. And I was told by his aide-de-camp that they didn't, as he put it, do due diligence, which means they didn't read what I supposedly said. And besides, they were under pressure from the US Congress to show that they were not anti-Israeli. And it was at a time when Ban Ki-moon was running for a second term as Secretary General. So one sees the insidious way in which these political maneuvers play out, and it's sort of reminiscent of the Soviet system where the leadership reaches out to some lowly individual like myself in order to demonstrate a kind of larger political reality. What I'm trying to explain by these references to my experience is the degree to which these quasi-NGOs stir up trouble for those seeking to document allegations concerning Israel's violation and actually weaken the way in which the organization can function on behalf of the international community and the promoting what I think one would hope would be the global interests rather than merely succumbing to the national interests of the most powerful members of the organization. And one of the most disturbing features of this is the degree to which the US ambassadors at the UN swallow what UN Watch and NGO Monitor, both kind of quasi-governmental organizations, what they feed them. And again, in my case, Susan Rice and Samantha Power, both of whom know better, just routinely repeated the kind of denunciations and defamations that were associated with these attacks. The second approach used on behalf of Israel to weaken and discredit the UN involves trying to both manipulate the organization and to undermine it at the same time. It's a very sophisticated kind of relationship to the UN that Israel has. It both pretends to be victimized by the organization, and yet because of its relationship to the US and its clever use of these kind of tactics, it intimidates the organization more than any other government, however large or small. It's a kind of tour de force of a negative variety that it is able, despite being so uncooperative, to be able to impose its views. And the UN is, rather than being biased, it leans over backward in every particular context to make sure that Israel's best arguments are made fully available and given as much attention as possible. In other words, the reality is just the opposite of the perception in this country. If anything, the organization could be criticized as being indifferent to the Palestinian reality and biased toward not offending Israel. It's quite an amazing manipulation of the reality, at least as I experienced and understood it. And there was a recent speech by the Israeli ambassador, Ron Prosser, that spoke of that the tide of hatred aimed at Israel within the UN. And that kind of language is used to influence the atmosphere here in Washington and the Congress, and it's a sad commentary on the state of our democracy that so many of our elected representatives swallow this central lie about the UN, an organization the world desperately needs to be strong and effective, because of these kind of defamatory tactics. Rather than the UN reflecting the supposed hostility of oppressive regimes to Israel, the UN has increasingly been neutralized in any effort to produce a sustainable peace that is just for both peoples. One forgets that it is the UN that failed the Palestinian people when the British gave up their colonial mandate and dumped the future of Palestine into the hands of the UN. It's unlike any other place in the world as far as UN responsibility is concerned. And so, again, the criticism that Kerry made and others, that the UN devotes a disproportionate attention to the Israel-Palestine conflict, is really the reverse of what it should be doing. And that is, for over 65 years, it's failed to realize the right of self-determination for the Palestinian people that every other major people in the world has enjoyed and achieved. And we have reached a time when we should expect and demand of not only the US government, but of the international community, that it fulfills this long neglected responsibility, and not to overlook the present realities of both peoples and the mistakes of the past, but to create some kind of future that is viable for both peoples. My time is rapidly elapsing, more rapidly than my text, unfortunately. But let me just say the following, that Palestine may be winning the legitimacy war being waged throughout the world and at the United Nations to obtain popular support for the Palestinian cause with the peoples of the world. But it is continuing to lose the geopolitical war that is being waged within the organization. And it's very important to keep these two wars in mind. The legitimacy war is a war waged by people to achieve rights and justice. The geopolitical war is being waged by powerful governmental forces linked to powerful economic forces that seek to sustain unjust structures of authority and power. Let me stop there and thank you for your patience.